So to begin with, we wanted to throw to the candidates and give you both the opportunity in 3 minutes to present an opening address. Zoe, would you like to begin?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to Brighton Hebrew Congregation for the invitation. It's lovely to be here again. As the member for Goldstein, I've spent the last 3 years getting to know our Jewish community, and obviously the last 18 months also have been a very challenging time. My vision is to be a leader of the Goldstein community where you can connect with me, and to be a leader who stands up actively against anti-Semitism, both in our community and around the country. I see hope and will act for a Jewish community in unity that can go beyond this fraught time and get back to living life normally, not overwhelmed by hate and distress. Things that you need to know about me. I will never use your pain for political gain. I'm more worried about you and your families than I am about votes, and that's why I'm here tonight. I think using the Jewish community's pain for political purposes is making the community more exposed to risk, and I think that's dangerous. As a foreign correspondent, I've seen the spike in anti-Semitism in the US after the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and I've spoken to many Jewish people when I was a foreign correspondent about that. And I've also covered attacks on synagogues in the United States during that time. I object to the conflict in Israel and Gaza being used as a vote getter by both the Coalition and the Greens in different ways, and I won't do that. I don't think it's good for our community in general. I don't think it's good for our Jewish community. I don't think it's good for our country. Our strength is multiculturalism. So many of us have come here from different places, including many of your relatives. This multiculturalism and social cohesion must be protected, and it's too precious to be exploited. I welcome this conversation tonight, but I hope that we can have it through the lens of social cohesion here in our community of Goldstein. As a person who's seen conflict and civil unrest around the world, I do have empathy for all people, and in this case, I can also see the direct risk of playing communities of people off against each other. I think that while people will have conflicting views about war, our focus should be here in Australia and in our community. So my focus has been not on grandstanding, but on very specific and concrete outcomes, which no doubt we'll talk about tonight. But some of those include getting safety and security grants fast-tracked for organisations in our community, including the one that we're sitting in this evening. Pushing for an anti-Semitism envoy, which, as you know, is now in place. Getting doxing banned after Jewish creatives were doxed, and that was an initiative that began with me. That is now legislated. And also pushing for a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism, and backing Julie and Lisa on that in the Parliament, to depoliticise this incredibly serious issue. Within our community just recently, we held a Courage to Care workshop where we brought community leaders together to talk with each other about how to be upstanders, not only on anti-Semitism, but on racism and discrimination generally. And this is an initiative that I will continue should I be re-elected. These are actions completed. These are not just words. These are things that I have done while I have been your member, particularly since the October 7 attacks. And I will continue to do this work if I'm re-elected, whether you vote for me or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoe. Tim, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers for bringing together this important event. And it's also good to be back at the Brighton Hebrew Congregation. 3 years ago, when I left office, the Australian Jewish community was recognised as the over-contributors to the Australian way of life that they are. but too many now feel marginalised and afraid. And frankly, this isn't the Jewish community that I have known throughout my entire adult life, because what I have always seen in Melbourne's Jewish community, even in difficult times, has been a sanguine optimism against the odds, the living, breathing spirit of mutual support and determination that can only be built from the compounding stories of thousands of years of endurance against the odds, and that's never been afraid. And because of my Armenian heritage and the connection between the Ottoman Empire getting away with the first genocide in the 20th century that inflicted on my people justification for one of the greatest crimes in human history, and the natural understanding that's connected to the Shoah, there has been a natural understanding of the challenges faced to the Jewish people. And of course, as a founding patron of Liberal Friends of Israel, I've always been openly supportive of Zionism and of course the cause brings together many of the people in this room. When I was last in Parliament, I used that time as a member of the Intelligence Security Committee with my former colleague, Senator James Patterson, to list Hamas and Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation. I actually remember when we did that, and most people shrugged and thought it was a rather unremarkable act. And I must concede, at the time, it seemed like an entirely logical thing to do, and it went past relatively unremarked. But now we realise actually how important it is. Like standing up at that time and speaking out against anti-Semitism as we did in the Parliament, even though at the time it didn't feel perhaps sometimes as important as it does now. Because what it highlights is how important leadership matters when the times are good or comparatively good, because of what you need to build up in the stock when things turn. And it's because of the failure of our leaders at the moment that disappoints me most. It's both the failing of our Prime Minister and the government, but also, of course, of many in our federal Parliament, as well as our state Premier and, of course, of our state governments that distresses me most. Of course, I'm a great believer in freedom of speech, and I don't walk away from it, but rights come with responsibilities, including the responsibility of the Speaker to measure their conduct and for responsible people to stand up and use their voice to call out the conduct of others. And it's not just the words from those who sadly we knew would say anti-Semitic things that have disappointed me. Frankly, it has been the silence of our leaders that has angered me. And I know it isn't just angered me, it's obviously angered many people in this room too, because you tell me all the time. Because from the steps of the Sydney Opera House to the protests of Princes Park in our own Caulfield South to the fired bombing of the Adass Israel Synagogue, it is simply unimaginable that there has been so much delayed disinterest in confronting this moral evil head on. So, what is our action plan as part of a Liberal coalition government should we be elected? First, we have already called for the National Cabinet to make anti-Semitism a priority, and after a dithering, we have eventually seen this being done. Second, a report has been handed down to the government by the Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism, but it should be released and acted upon. Third, we push for mandatory minimum sentences for terrorist offences, which include anti-Semitic violence. Fourth, to introduce laws to make it a crime to threaten violence against places of worship and display symbols of terrorist organisations. Fifth, and the member referred to this, my dear friend and very long-time friend, Julian Leeser, has called for a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on Australian university campuses. That is our policy. It should be done, and we will deliver it. 6, we will set up a national task force to combat anti-Semitism. 7th, we will continue to support local security upgrades for community infrastructure as appropriate. 8th, we will not import people from conflict zones through backdoor visa options for partisan political objectives, nor without proper identity and security assessments. 9th, we will deport non-citizens who are engaged in criminal activity and pose a threat to our nation. And 10th, you will be able to judge us by not just our words, but by our deeds. From the Prime Minister down, we will show moral leadership and make it clear that the Australians of Jewish heritage should be respected equally in our nation. And finally, we will also make it clear that Israel is Australia's ally and that we see no... and that we see no moral equivalence between a liberal democracy defending its sovereignty and its citizens and the actions of a terrorist organisation that has no moral qualms taking children from the arms of their mothers and treating them horrifically, and then cowardly placing the women and children of their own bloodline in the front of bullets that have been fired back at them. It is simply morally wrong. Thank you.
Okay, so the candidates are off script now and are in our hands, Rebecca, and also in the audience hands. And I'm going to start with a question that a lot of people in the audience sent in. Tim, you used the Z word, Zionism, and for a lot of people that is a dirty word, not in this room, but outside in the streets of Australia. I'd like to ask both candidates what they understand by the word Zionism and whether they would publicly stand up and declare that they are a Zionist. And simply because you spoke last, Tim, I'm going to address that to Zoe first of all.
Well, my understanding of Zionism is a belief in the State of Israel, and that's a belief that I share. Would I declare myself a Zionist? Well, it's not something I've ever thought that I needed to do. If I believe in the State of Israel, then I believe that is the right of the people in this room to hold that position. I agree with you that, and probably the motivation for the question is that the term Zionist has been twisted into something that it isn't, and I don't think that's appropriate. A belief in the State of Israel and the sanctity of that, I also hold that, and I believe in that completely.
And
So I believe that Zionism is that the right of Jewish people to have a homeland in the land of Israel, and I was hoping that answer wasn't controversial, need applause, but anyway. I have said quite publicly all my adult life, I have described myself as a Zionist or pro-Zionist. Some people like the term feminist. You know, can you be as a man pro-feminist or just feminist? But I've always just said Zionist, but I'm happy to accept the differential if that would make people more comfortable, because I have always supported that position. And I've said publicly as well, I always took that view. I always had people from the Jewish community always say, thank you for saying that publicly. And I have always said, naively, I concede, thank you for doing so. And I have always said, I've always been confused by why you are so generous in your thanks, but I appreciate the thanks. But of course, I have been schooled over the past couple of years about why people used to thank me for doing so. So am I Zionist or pro-Zionist? Yes, very comfortably. Would I happily say it in the forum? Well, I think I've just demonstrated it.
Thank you both. Both of you mentioned in your openings about the scourge of anti-Semitism which has overtaken this country. It's always been an issue, but unfortunately since October 7 we've seen that surge to a point of out of control. We've obviously had the firebombing terror attack, which we have already mentioned at Das Israel. We've had the incident, the Burgatory protest, where literally members of a synagogue had to be evacuated during Shabbat prayer. Not to mention every sphere of Australian life, be that business, the arts, media, schools, universities, has been affected. How did we get here? And I think that's a question that went through probably every Jewish person's mind, because it was a bit of a surprise. How did we get here? And what could have been done better in the last 18 months to have avoided where we currently sit? Zoe?
I don't think we've been very effective at having a collaborative public conversation about this. I think, unfortunately, very soon after October 7, there was division that became apparent within community, and I think the government was very slow to respond. I was in the background pushing the Labor government to be more vocal, And on several occasions when there were incidents, I spoke directly to the Prime Minister's office and said, you need to speak about this. And you will note that the Prime Minister did then in the chamber eventually speak about anti-Semitism. I think that the tone of the national conversation and the grandstanding on this issue, partly by the Coalition, but also, to be fair, by the Greens, has created a community-wide argument where particular people in the community have decided to take a side of judgment, and that has spilt over into anti-Semitism across this country. I absolutely abhor the very idea that the actions of the government of Israel, which you can agree with or not, should be seen to be the responsibility of Jewish people living here in Goldstein, who then bear the consequences of that in the form of anti-Semitism. And that behaviour has to stop. The grandstanding, particularly of the Greens in the chamber, but also outside it, has been really unhelpful in that regard. And I think it's enabled behaviour in our communities. That means that children are frightened to go to school. People that I know, Jewish friends, were doxxed and have had their businesses boycotted and all sorts of awful things as a result of people's judgment about what is happening overseas. And that is completely not only inappropriate, it's abhorrent, it's disgraceful.
How do we get here? A failure of leadership. How do we fix it? Leadership. And the reality is, in the days immediately after the events of October 7, 2023, we saw protests on the steps of Sydney Opera House where both the New South Wales state government and the police force and the federal government tolerated the most despicable and disgusting protests in favour of those horrific and violent acts. Once that tone was set about what we were prepared to accept in our country, it allowed an ancient prejudice to be set free without any sense of harsh criticism or judgment by our leaders. And it has spiralled out of control now to the point where we talk about a dust synagogue, of course, down the road, but of course there's been many fire bombings in Sydney as well, and in many other parts of our country where people increasingly feel violated, threatened, and they no longer feel safe in their communities or their homes. Once you allow these sorts of ancient prejudices to thrive in the way that they have, it is very hard to get back into the box in the way that they have been unleashed. It is going to take a Herculean effort to address it. That is why the measures we have put forward are so strong and so immediate. It is why Peter Dutton, which I understand is being critiqued by others as suggesting somehow that is not motivated by anything other than the best intent, I think, frankly, misunderstands the scale of the threat that is being faced, because we also know from the lessons of history that, yes, this starts with the Jewish community, but once we tolerate on the Jewish community, it moves on to other sections of the community, and I'm simply not prepared to accept that as a standard for our nation, more or less, more importantly, because of how it can then be targeted towards other sections of the community. We need to stand up, we need to confront this evil now. We need to bring our country back together, and that starts most importantly with leadership from the top. We need more strongly also from our state governments, particularly this one, and we need to stop the moral equivalence of every time we say there is anti-Semitism, automatically deferring to throwing in Islamophobia as well, when it is not an example that can be thrown automatically in because we're seeking to appease political issues rather than addressing the moral evil that we are confronting right now.
just speaking to that another step further, the fear that the community has felt literally from October 7 onwards, to the point where I'm sure many of you have had conversations. I know I've heard of conversations, I've interviewed people who have lived in Australia many generations in their family, people who have a good established life, actually contemplating making Aliyah, immigrating to Israel, should a Labor government be re-elected, and looking at the balance of power with the Greens as well. So to that point, talking very clearly, I really want on a human level the fear, because the fear of children, I know of young people, not necessarily older vulnerable people, young people who sleep with a knife under their bed or a hammer. This is the reality. People that were too scared to walk around their neighbourhoods and still are reserved, particularly women as well, who already have that heightened awareness. To speak to that fear, what do you both have to say?
I have a friend who, her daughter is my daughter's best friend, and she has a younger brother. And I don't believe he's slept a full night since October 7. He's been so frightened that someone would come into the house and pull him out of his bed. For me, that is the heart story of the experience of many people in our community since the terrorist attack. The sense of never being able to feel safe. And so in all of the work that I've tried to do behind the scenes with the government to get measures in place, I have thought of that child and the safety of that family as the centrepiece of trying to take actions, not talk, actions that would bring about safety for everyone in our community. Everyone deserves to feel safe at home and at school and at work and walking down the street and on public transport. And the fact that this child was only willing to go back to school once he was sure that there would be armed guards in the foyer as he entered his place of education is of immense concern to me. So my entire focus has been to try to do things to improve the safety of the community and to push the government. Many of the things on my opponent's list I agree with, not all of them. Many of them I've already talked to the government about. Many of them are already underway. Some are already done, and I've been involved in those things. And so the work is happening to try to bring the safety back.
Now, when I was recently at Bialik and I was chatting to the principal there, and of course there's a large number of students that come from within the Goldstein electorate, the catchment, from Bialik and bus there every day. And I was asking about what trends they were seeing, and one of the key trends was the increase in the number of people who were switching, or students who were switching from public schools for the first time in their life because they didn't traditionally go to a Jewish school because they no longer felt safe in a public school because of either the fear or the reality of anti-Semitism that they were experiencing. Now, it is not to dismiss broader issues that adults face, but when young children are facing an environment of prejudice where they no longer feel safe in their community or their education environment, that is the worst possible lived reality of what our country, something I would never believe I'd see in our country, frankly. So that is the lived reality of what I hear. What I hear more than anything else, though, apart from what my opponent talked about, is the sense of abandonment that many people feel. The reason they look at options like Aliyah isn't because they don't think, and I addressed this in my opening remarks, there have been plenty of times in the Jewish community's history in Australia where they have faced adversity before, let alone what has led them to come to this country in the first place in migration waves and the need to start again and to lean into the challenges of our country. It's the sense of abandonment that they have felt from so much of their government for the first time, I think, in our nation's history, and that no longer can they rely on the institutions that are there to protect them. And that, I think, is the most distressing thing. And a sense of isolation from a lot of the community organisations, from their government and from many friends or people they felt who were their friends. And that includes so many of philanthropists who donated enormous amounts of money to arts organisations who then just completely turned on them overnight and rationalised the justification of the murdering of their bloodline in Israel, or justifying the anti-Semitism at home, what people are experiencing on the streets. It's just beyond recognition for the Australia that most of us know. And it's that sense of abandonment that is so much of justification for fear. And that's where good people can stand up, can confront, and can lead. And that is where the failure has been.
To prove the technology works, we've got a question here from the floor about the candidates' views of the ABC and whether they support the way the public broadcaster has reported on Israel and the Jewish community. And I just want to build on that. Since October the 7th, we've seen a range of publicly funded institutions, whether it's universities, academics on research grants, creative spaces, and the ABC, all we would perceive to be fanning the flames of anti-Semitism and normalising it. All it seems that we've heard from the government is mealy-mouthed condemnation, but no real tangible action. Meanwhile, in America, since Donald Trump's come in, he's slashing funding from offending institutions. Should our government be sending a stronger message by cutting funding, public funding, taxpayer dollars from institutions that don't do enough to tackle anti-Semitism? And I'll start with Tim.
So I'm going to start by breaking some people's hearts in the room. I don't watch the ABC much. In fact, I don't watch much television these days, but the last time I watched it was when, what was the name of the rally in town at the steps of Parliament? Sorry? Never Again. Yeah, no, I was at that. And I remember I watched the ABC report of that, and it was a completely distorted reality from the event that I was at. And it was an event where everybody came together overwhelmingly. Okay, well, the overwhelmingly to bring people together to support the Jewish community in a time of need. It was entirely positive and focused on our sense of unity, not just the Jewish community, but the Australian people. Up the road were some Palestinian activists towards Fitzroy, and it was made out like there was equal camps and equal justification, and it was just the weirdest parallel universe of a reporting that I had ever seen. And so if that is a reflection, I say if, because as I said, I don't watch any other reporting, then I would say that is perhaps a little askew, to say the least. Do I believe that we should be then slashing and burning funding accordingly? I don't think that's the answer. I think the ABC absolutely does, though, need some serious reform, because I am very disappointed in its priorities and its focus. I don't believe these days when most people look at the ABC, they see themselves. I don't think they see their lives lived out through the content that's produced on the ABC, and that's not just an issue for the Jewish community. I think that's an issue for the entire Australian community, from people in rural and regional areas to different states. I think it's a completely suck-duck organisation based out of the inner west of Sydney, where you see inner left progressive worldview from the inner west of Sydney. That's the values, the views and the content that's produced, and that is not Australia. It likes to project that onto the rest of Australia, but that is not Australia, and until it does so, it is going to have social licence. And if it doesn't reform to address those challenges, frankly, I do think there's a justification for significant change.
Thank you, Tim. Zoe?
So I'll begin by addressing the heckler, if you don't mind. I wasn't at that event, but I haven't attended any rallies on this subject, pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel. I've attended several. I've attended I'm speaking, if you don't mind. I've attended several vigils with the Jewish community, within our community, and also in Caulfield, just outside my electorate. I don't think it's appropriate to attend rallies on this matter. Vigils are a different question. I think the rallies, particularly the pro-Palestinian rallies, have been inflammatory in many ways, and I think, to be fair, I didn't attend the rally in question either. In regard to the ABC and media, I think it's a very dangerous pathway to go down for government to be making heavy-handed decisions around controlling media based on not liking a particular kind of coverage. Independent media is critical to democracy. And if you see what's happening in the United States with Donald Trump trying to shut down independent media, that is a very dangerous rabbit hole, and it will neither benefit this community or any other community for government to start trying to control the media. The more diverse media we have in this country, the better. And the ABC and SBS are critically important publicly funded media, a rare bird in the international environment. And I would absolutely not countenance the government exerting control, executive overreach on the public broadcasters.
We've spoken at length about the fear that Jewish people have felt post-October 7 and the different attacks that they have faced. We have a question from Ellie, which was pre-submitted. He said, on a weekly basis, we see people in kafirs chanting, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and all Zionists are terrorists. The Jewish community take these as overt anti-Semitism, and yet nothing is done to stop them. Would you ban them? Zoe? Yeah. Would you ban these incessant rallies that happen and the hate speech that they propel against the Jewish community?
Well, hate speech, we've already done that in the federal parliament. Can I finish my answer? Hate crimes went through the parliament and I supported that legislation. And, you know, my opponent has a very open view around allowing people to express hate in the public arena. That's on the public record. I have very strongly opposed hate speech and indeed supported the legislation that went through the parliament, but also initiated and supported the doxing ban after hundreds of Jewish creatives were doxed, many from this community, and the coalition voted against that bill. So where's the consistency here? You can't cherry pick your policies, sorry. You either show consistency or you don't, and there's deep inconsistency in the coalition's position on this. In regard to protest, peaceful protest is fine. Violent, abusive protest, hate speech, hateful behaviour, not fine. And that needs to be better managed by police if that's what's happening.
Your record on freedom of speech was brought up.
Sure, no, I'm more than happy to talk about this because my position actually is consistent, which is that I fundamentally oppose intimidation, I fundamentally oppose harassment, but I also believe in the importance of being able to open debate issues that are challenging and difficult. And this question, as an example, is raised. And I was in a forum recently with supporters where the conversation about could you ban an expression like from the river to the sea, and I said I don't believe you can. It's not because I agree with it, but all discussions around freedom of speech necessarily involve defending expressions you may not agree with, because you don't need to defend freedom of speech from the excessive use of please and thank you. We have to involve ourselves in conversation around what's difficult, and I note that despite the question, my opponent didn't actually say she should ban it because that's part of the challenge. I use specific definitions, specific words to define where the law should set the line. Other people use nice big broad terms so that they can capture people's emotions and claim the justification they're on your side while they're actually misleading you. I like to set clear parameters so you know where things are, because what I actually know is that those who seek to manipulate and use those laws to their ends, use them to their advantage. And we've seen this throughout many times in human history. And weaponise them against often marginalised sections of the community to empower the strong against the weak. Freedom of speech is actually a defence for the weak against the strong. That's why it's important, including often marginalised section communities. So I will defend freedom of speech against difficult debates. I realise sometimes that will put people into a robust conversation. I've had this conversation sometimes with rabbis where they want to set parameters, and then I've had to turn around to them and say, just so you know, if we apply that rule consistently, you want me to apply that rule consistently, I would then, therefore, as was demonstrated in Tasmania, mean that this was demonstrated in the Porteous case, mean that a Catholic priest or, of course, a rabbi in the context of the lessons of the Torah would be in violation of law for saying that marriage is a union between a man and a woman. Now, of course, my personal circumstances are very well known that I'm an openly gay man married to my husband. I will defend your right to express the view that a religious interpretation of marriage is between a man and a woman. I do not believe that should be banned. Welcome to a free society. The question is, when things become intimidating harassment through people's acts, that is when you get the law in place, and you have to make sure limited. So when you see in Australian university campuses, students going on campus and being intimidated so they don't go on and get educated, that's intimidation. It actually doesn't matter what the cause is, but it obviously is particularly egregious when it's specifically designed to make sure that Jewish students go on campus. When you see a situation where people are targeted because of who they are, not to be free participants in our society, that is intimidation and that is harassment. We must root out this moral evil. We must stand up for it very clearly. We must have well-targeted and designed laws, and that is a consistent position, not the cute throwing around of broad words that we have seen in the previous answer.
So just to be clear, in 2014, my opponent told the Australian Jewish News, in its current form, the Racial Discrimination Act is a law that violates human rights and it must be fixed. Repeal it in its entirety so that we actually have active, robust discussion in public life. Despite pushback from the Jewish community, which said, AIJAC said, the minimum you would expect in a country like Australia is that people who are vilified by this material have some recourse to the law, my opponent continued with this stance and doubled down on the push to weaken race hate laws, arguing that intimidate and humiliate were too subjective. Quote, it's always very difficult to know what would offend somebody else. I think it's a very low bar. From the Australian Jewish News in 2014. So it's very convenient to take this position now with an election in the offing when he is well on the record with those positions previously.
I get a right to reply to that. I am happy to have this conversation. Bring it on. Because I know I had it in one of the forums we hosted in Nelson Week where one of your campaigners without their T-shirt turned on, and I said to them, have you actually read my submission to the reform proposal we made for in the Parliament a few years later? He said he had, so I said, great, can you actually tell me what I actually wrote in it? Of course, he then blundered for a while until admitting basically he hadn't. And I said, what I believe in is a consistent standard in law that applies to everybody equally. Currently, under Australian law, we have a provision where it says it's unlawful to offend, insult, humiliate, and intimidate a person on the basis of race, colour, national, ethnic origin. No equivalent standard exists on the basis of disability. So, according to you, under current law, it's fine to let rip on people with a disability, or on the basis of... Sorry, no, hang on, let me finish. As you said, you asked a question, I'm responding. On the basis of disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender itself, etc., etc., etc. And my submission said we should have a standard that's consistent, that's universal, that applies to every person and every Australian, because I believe equality before the law is a foundational principle of our democracy, and that all people should be treated equally. And I proudly stand by that, and I'll happily send you a copy of my submission, which you clearly have not read.
I've received 2 messages, and more are coming in asking if I was editor of the AJN at that time in 2014. I was, and you can't really believe what you had in the AJN in 2014. I don't know what I was up to. Anyway, over to Rebecca.
Further to that point, Australia has always prided itself on being a multicultural success. We have always prided our contributions of our immigrants, post-war, before then as well, and the contributions they've made to this country and the infrastructure in all areas of life. But clearly we have a tear in the very fabric of Australian society. And it's all good and well to talk about laws and the politics of the issue, but the fact of the matter remains that Jewish families too often are stopping themselves from going into particular spaces in our own city because they feel unsafe because of these protests. They're threatening, they're harassing, they're aggressive. So with all that said, how do we, first of all, how do Jewish people feel safe to enter all spaces in their own cities throughout this country? And what do we do to enhance multiculturalism and get social cohesion somewhat back on track? Zoe, I'll begin with you.
Look, I think we need to increase our capacity for civil conversation, and that was something that we tried to begin with our Courage to Care workshop. It's now been taken up by yet another school, and I know that they do a lot of work in schools, but one of the primary schools has engaged them to do a workshop after we did ours. We had huge take-up in that event. We had leaders of about 100 community organisations in the room. Enabling them with skills to call out negative behaviour. I would say too that I think that in general we need to be able to have disagreement, civil disagreement. And we also, in this particular case, we need to be able to separate what's happening in Israel and Gaza from what's happening here. People need to be able to go about their daily life in safety and not feel threatened by someone who has made a judgment about them in relation to a war happening overseas. Which is why a lot of my focus has been on what we can do locally to create those tools within our community. I think social media has a lot to answer for. People are so enabled in the language that they now use online that some of that is spilling over into real life, and that's a real problem. So, you know, conversation is important. Being in a room here together is important. It might not feel comfortable for everyone, but it's part of that process, and we need to do more of it. And having civil conversations with people that you disagree with is a highly productive thing to do, and I would highly recommend it.
Well, no one can argue that it's important to bring people together and have important and respectful conversations. It is important. But it's also making sure that we provide spaces for people in community to have those conversations. You know, this afternoon I was down at a synagogue, I won't mention which one, but we were talking about the importance of social infrastructure, particularly post-COVID. Now, I know that might seem like a while ago now, but I know talking to some of the rabbis, Rotary clubs and other organisations, that there was such a culture of expectation that kept these organisations together up until COVID, where, you know, Les and Leon, I'm just using those as examples, there's not a gendered intention to it, it's just used to sit there and there on a Friday night and they'd check in on each other, and because one of them turned up, if one was missing, then they'd check in on each other throughout the week, at the following week if they didn't turn up, etc. And the same is true for the people who sat next to Rotary or Probus or whatever other organisation there was in the community. And a lot of COVID wiped out that and that habitual nature of life, and the need to reinvest in that component of the structure of engagement for people. And so I think there's a bigger project in place that we need to do as a society. And we sometimes think about things like anti-Semitism. We think, well, we need to build bigger walls or more CCTV, and that's important. I'm not arguing against that. But it's actually the social infrastructure and the social bonds that we need to reinvest in as well, because it's actually about how do we build those bonds through a form of mutual protection and support. That also requires effort. I had some, and I don't want to verbal her, but the Mayor of the City of Glenara, Simon Smoot, recently about how we're going to, if I have the great privilege, of course, of being a member for Goldstein, about how we could look at work that could be done in that space to use the local Jewish community as an exemplar for what can be replicated across not just Glenara but for the rest of the country, to build out a sense of greater safety and support, because it's something that if we check in on each other and build out a greater sense of mutualism between each other, we actually build a greater bond and a greater sense of understanding to strengthen our country from the citizen up and the family up to the community up.
Thank you.
Inevitably, we've had a lot of questions specifically for Zoe on her record on Israel. So I'm going to lump them all together and give you the opportunity to address them in one go. 2021, you signed a Do Better on Palestine letter, and when asked if you would subsequently take your signature off it or retract it, you declined. In February 2024, you signed a joint statement effectively calling for the reinstatement of funding for UNRWA. And then more recently, a prominent staffer of Climate 200, one of your significant backers, is virulently anti-Israel and has called for a boycott of Israeli businesses. And I'm just going to throw in one more. I think over 75% of your votes have been alongside the Greens. So why do you pretend or claim to be a friend of the community? I'm using their words here. Some people would feel a little guilty by association, and that as much as you say you're a friend of the community, and as much as you say you're focusing on events over here rather than things that happen overseas, you're seen as sleeping with the enemy.
Convinced that was a particularly objective framing of the question, Zeddy, but I'll take it. I'll take it anyway. Okay. Number one, the Palestinian letter. I'm a journalist. I'm a former journalist. I believe journalists should be able to be safe in conflict zones, and I don't believe that journalists should be targeted by military organisations, and that's why I signed it, and that's why I won't remove my name from it. Second was the UNRWA letter. So at the time that that letter was written and signed, there were 70 trucks a day getting into Gaza from an average of 500 a day before October 7 and against a need of 700 a day. The expert advice from multiple briefings was that the only organisation capable of delivering that humanitarian aid was UNRWA. There had been an investigation, as you're all aware, and via UN oversight, those who were alleged to have been involved in the attack had been removed from UNRWA, and also additional oversight was placed on UNRWA. The letter, it's important to note that the letter actually said, if no other organisation can be found to deliver this aid, UNRWA should do it, and evidently no other organisation was found. I'll note that Canada, New Zealand and others also restored funding to UNRWA for the same reason. I spoke with the Israeli ambassador just last week when I was in Canberra, and I said, I'm agnostic as to who delivers the aid. Do we yet have an option for someone who can do it? He said no. Rubbish. You can tell me it's rubbish, but I was the one who met with the Israeli ambassador, and that's what he told me. Third thing. Climate 200 manage their own staff. I don't agree with the BDS movement in any way, shape or form. I've been very much on the record on this. Boycotting businesses owned by people from Israel or Jewish people is an absolute disgrace. And I know that businesses have been boycotted here in our community since October 7, and I think that's absolutely disgusting. That should not be happening. And the Greens, so of roughly 40 Greens policies and motions moved over the term, I voted yes to 22 of them and no to 18 of them, so that's about 50-50. Similar with Labor and the Coalition. On raw numbers, I voted for more than double the number of Coalition policies as Greens policies. The numbers that the Coalition are using to mislead you are to do with largely procedural motions. The crossbench has a principle that we vote against gag motions because frequently the government tries to gag debate to push its legislation through. The broader crossbench, including the Greens, but all of the independents, think that's anti-democratic. So all of us vote against those motions. Those motions are sitting within that percentage. But if you look at Greens policy moved, it's about 50-50. And same with Labor, and about 40-something percent coalition motions that I voted on. And I'll just finish by saying the whole point of being an independent is that I don't just vote for my party's position 100% of the time. I vote for our community, having analysed policy, legislation, consulted experts and considered the best outcome for most people on the basis of whether it's good policy or not. So the fact that I've voted roughly half and half across the spectrum actually shows that independence works.
Just a follow-up on the Greens, because I've got a message here saying I need to ask about the Greens and preferencing. And we had a question earlier that somebody sent in saying, will you pledge to preference them last, Zoe?
I don't direct preferences. I didn't direct preferences at the last election. I ran on an open ticket. I know that people from across the spectrum vote for me, or certainly that's what happened last time. So I will ask only that people give me their number one and they number every other box in order to avoid voting informal. People vote as they choose down the ticket. I just want the number one, the rest is up to you.
Sure. But I also want to make some observations about some of the remarks. Just to clarify, Coalition's position is we do not believe we should be using Australian taxpayers' money to give to organisations that facilitate terrorism. Again, one of those things that I used to think wasn't controversial. In addition to that, I think that when you have people at the heart of Climate 200 actively advocating for anti-Semitic BDS movements, I think people, if they seriously mean everything they just said, have to say, are you going to hand back that racist anti-Semitic money then? $600,000 and you're taking it from an organisation where you have people who have actively been advocating for a racist and anti-Semitic cause. I think that's tainted money.
From Tim?
Sorry?
Where's your money coming from?
From many people within this community. I can assure you I will not take a dime from a racist or an anti-Semite.
Declare where your money's coming from.
Zoe, you know as well as I do that when you take $600,000 from Climate 200, one, the donors aren't declared for Climate 200. Second, you actually don't declare all the people on
That
your
is
website.
absolutely untrue. I'm sorry, that is wrong.
Okay, so will you list and publish all of the donors to Climate 200?
My donors are all published on my website
No, they're not.
transparently and pretty much in real time.
Sorry.
I think my opponent declared 0 donations after the last election.
if you go to zoedaniel.com.au/donate right now, you can see that half of them are anonymous. Secondly, you don't actually publish all the people at Climate 200. It actually passes money through that to hide where those donations are, and then passes the money through to you, so you don't actually know where it is. And we absolutely run money through the Liberal Party, as political parties do, because we are not doing what you are doing, which is setting up for what Climate 200 is, which is a private company designed to subvert Australian electoral law, but it does not change one thing. It does not change one thing. This is an organisation that employs people who are engaged in advocating for a racist, anti-Semitic BDS movement that transfers. Well, you just heard the member for Goldstein say they thought it was an inappropriate cause and it was disgusting and despicable, and all I am doing is repeating the same sentiment. $600,000 from a racist and anti-Semitic cause. I'm sorry, that's tainted money and it should be returned if you believe those statements. Yeah. So, when it comes to the question that Zeddy just asked about the Greens, it is sometimes challenging between the different, unfortunately, candidates who put themselves forward for public office, and sometimes the values and attitudes they hold, particularly sometimes because of the anti-Semitic attitudes that are out there. But certainly if the Greens are not dead last, they will certainly be either second last or dead last on my how to vote card.
Thank you. We touched on UNRWA. I want to know from both of you, I'm going to start with you, Tim. Do you think that Australia should recognise a Palestinian state, and if so, under what circumstances?
The only circumstances that I would accept is firstly if a Palestinian authority recognised the right of Israel to exist with safety and security, and the right of Israelis to live in peace. That would be an absolute absolute requirement for any condition to have a Palestinian state. And we are not at that point. We have not been at that point, as far as I'm aware, in my entire lifetime. I don't believe, unfortunately, we're going to be at that point anytime. And I think worse than that, by actively advocating for a Palestinian state in current circumstances, we're rewarding incredibly bad behaviour, including terrorism.
Yes, under a negotiated two-state solution. Not now. Now's not the time.
Okay, we've run out of time, but I just want to hit you with two more questions. One away from all the issues specifically of Jewish concern, the cost of living crisis, what can be done to deal with that? As Jews, we suffer as much as everybody else. And the final question, which I'll throw in there for you, Zoe, as well, if there's a hung parliament, which party will you support to form a government? But let's start with cost of living crisis. I'll start with you, Tim, and then Zoe can conclude.
Sure. Thanks for leaving the small question to the end. So there's lots of different things that we can do around the cost of living crisis, but the most important thing is that we need to get interest rates down. That requires a stable environment of inflation, because there are different factors that obviously drive inflation, but one of the most important ones in Australia in comparison to other countries is government expenditure. That's why we've said the government needs to pull its belt in. There are different components of that. We go through every single different part of the government expenditure line by line, but it's very clear that government expenditure is at the highest rate it's been without a war or pandemic. We have allowed Canberra to engorge itself, and we need to be prudent and responsible. So when we talk about making sure that we don't want a big Canberra, what we're actually talking about is empowering communities, having a big community, and making sure that schemes are sustainable. We've had a massive explosion in those. So that's an important part of it, because that's what will get interest rates down. That's what means households will be able to manage their mortgages better and be in a better position to save, and at least to stop having the eating away of their savings. We've obviously announced measures like a reduction in the excise or tax on fuel. That will be delivered immediately should we get elected, so that households can get immediate relief for the assistance they need. but also what we are seeking to do with energy, not just rely on one strategy, but in terms of generation, but making sure we have different options on the table, including, of course, renewables, including, of course, gas, and, of course, building baseload nuclear for the future, so that we can build out and retire coal, but build out baseload capacity over the long run for the future, so that we're not just addressing the problem today, we're building out the future capacity for our country, and they're going on to create the jobs and economic opportunity for the next generations of Australians, so we can re-industrialise this country and build out a better future for everybody. So there's multiple things that we can do. We will continue to treat all of these issues as important, because we don't just want to build Australia, a better Australia for, as people point out, for the next 5 weeks or 4 weeks, or the next 3 years. We want to build out a better Australia that can deliver affordable living for Australians over the next 50, 100 years and for the generations yet to come.
So big structural changes that don't operate on 3-year election cycles. The first thing is everything on the table tax reform to put more money in people's pockets so that people can keep more of what they earn. That means spreading our tax base. The second piece is household electrification, enabling households to put on rooftop solar and batteries in order to reduce their energy costs, and that goes for small businesses as well. The third is universal, accessible, high-quality childcare at low cost for everyone to enable women to work. We need to unlock that 50% of the population that is constricted, and the fact that women often can't afford to work because the cost of getting care is so high. We need to enable that enormous economic resource. They're the main pieces. I think that cost of living is obviously a very prominent issue in this electorate and around the country, and so is the broader concern about the state of the economy. Getting our climate and energy policy on track is a big part of this, because things like escalating insurance costs are connected to what's happening with our climate. And climate remains, according to our data, the third highest priority for people in this electorate. They still want to see action on it, both from an economic and environmental point of view, and that's a big focus for me.
And upon Parliament, the independents hold the balance of power, Labour or Liberals?
I'll continue to consider the policies that are put on the table and the detail of those between now and the election. Is it okay if I finish? Thank you. And it will depend where the numbers fall. Also, anyone who's in business in this room would know that I would be an idiot to declare to you today and lose all my leverage over whichever party it is if that moment comes. So I will continue to do what I've done the whole time, which is be rigorous, be diligent, analyse policies, and consider the best and good faith outcome for our nation if I am blessed enough to be in that room on that day representing our community.
Just finally, there's so many more questions we can ask, and we certainly have no shortage from your participation tonight as well, so thank you very much. I want to give both candidates the opportunity to offer a closing statement, succinct. So in 2 minutes?
Look, I think a lot of it's been said tonight. I thank everyone for coming. It is a febrile environment, and I know that the emotion, particularly in this room, is very high, rightly. There is justifiable anxiety, concern and real fear in our Jewish communities across the country, and I see that every day in the Jewish people that I speak with in our community and among the Jewish volunteers who work on my campaign. I want you all to know that whether you vote for me or not, I will continue to fight for you in our parliament to implement the measures that you need to feel safe and for your families to feel safe. This should not be a political question. And I think actually one of the most important things is that the major parties, and I will include the Greens in that actually, the three, need to come back to a bipartisan or multi-partisan position on Israel, on anti-Semitism, in order to take the heat out of the political conversation and to enable real solutions for communities. And that's what I'll be pushing for.
I say with sadness that when I left being representative of this community 3 years ago, it's not the same community that it was. And of course the people in many cases are the same, but the fear that now exists, the lived experiences that people now have is not the same as when I left as being representative, and whether it's the cost of living challenges, the anti-Semitism, the fear of knife crime, violent home invasions, car thefts, etc. It's not the same experience, the lived experience that people had 3 years ago. Now, there are big challenges on the table, but I don't believe in kumbaya moments. I believe that if you want to see change, you have to vote for it, and you need leadership to confront it. Because if the solution is to get multi-party consensus from an anti-Semitic party to try and address the problems of anti-Semitism, I think it's politely wishful thinking. We have big challenges as a country. We need to confront them together. We need people of good character and good moral standing to stand up and to make sure that we are the best of ourselves as much as possible. That means we have to face a choice about who not just we want to represent our community, but of course other communities are facing the same choice about who they want to form the next government to lead our nation. This is going to be your choice coming up to the 3rd of May. But in the end, if we don't have people who are going to represent our community in Canberra, who are prepared to take responsibility, not just talk about reviews, not just talk about round tables, but are prepared to put concrete policies on the table, who are prepared to make the case for them, then get there and lead and continue to shoulder that burden on your behalf and lead not just in this country and justify it to our citizens, but more importantly to lead it to the rest of the world, because increasingly the challenge is going to be not just in Australia but beyond Australia. We will be a weaker nation. And what I'm prepared to give to you is a commitment very strongly that people will say whatever they want about me, and I'm sure there are diversity of views within this room, even amongst some of my supporters. But nobody has ever said I've been weak. I've always been prepared to stand up and be held accountable, even if necessary, against very difficult and adverse challenges. And that's the basis on which I put myself forward, to make sure that we lead, because the future of our country, its unity and its purpose is on the line.
Thank you all for attending. I'm just going to invite Daniel Abion, the President of the Executive Council of Australian Jury, to the bimmer.
Thank you everyone for attending. As we go into Pesach shortly, we will celebrate our freedom from slavery. We will lean in our chairs and drink wine to emulate and remember the practices of our free ancestors. The ultimate freedom is the right and the ability to participate in a healthy democracy, to choose our own leaders according to our values and beliefs. Events such as today remind us that participatory democracy, the right to vote, is no small thing. Indeed, for the Australian Jewish community, our votes and voices have never mattered more. For this country, the polls tell us that the election will be close, and there are several potential outcomes. For this electorate, we have two experienced and well-credentialed candidates. And finally, for this community, Australian Jews have never been tested as we have been in the last 18 months. In Australia, we Jews are small by number, but we are proud and we are here. And we are free to vote how we choose. Zoe, Tim, thank you both. Whoever wins Democracy succeeds because of your participation.